The main argument in favor of the idea that after death, a person supposedly ceases to exist is usually reduced to the assertion that no one has ever returned from the other side. It is hard to argue with this line of reasoning. However, in recent years, many studies have appeared in which the experiences of people who have undergone clinical death are described in detail. These patients came extremely close to the boundary of another world, yet nevertheless managed to return to life, noted the physicist Professor Werner Schiebeler. In the opinion of Werner Schiebeler, such accounts should not be ignored, since they serve as serious grounds for believing that physical reality is not the only form of our existence. The scholar pointed out that many people who temporarily left their bodies during clinical death spoke of a feeling of lightness, inner freedom, and profound peace. However, there were also opposite cases. It was precisely this negative experience that the professor paid special attention to in his works. Some who experienced clinical death described a sensation of falling into a bottomless void. Schiebeler emphasized that most often people who have been at the threshold of death recall precisely positive experiences. As an example of such an experience, he cited the story of the clairvoyant Arthur Ford, who also survived clinical death. Ford was in an extremely serious condition, and doctors considered him hopeless, believing that he had very little time left. One day, while I was in a ward at Flores Hospital, I seemed to fall into oblivion, and in the very next moment, I was already hovering above the hospital bed. I calmly observed my body, perceiving it as a foreign object. I was filled with extraordinary tranquility, and at the same time, it was as if I was simultaneously in the ward and in an astonishingly beautiful green valley, Arthur Ford recalled. In this valley, he saw people he had known during his lifetime, all of whom had already left the earthly world. Ford noted that many of them were difficult to recognize. Some who had died in old age appeared much younger, while those who had left life in childhood, on the contrary, seemed like adults. He was also surprised that he did not meet other people close to his heart, whom he expected to see there. Later, Ford learned that they were located in other lower levels. After some time, the green valley as if vanished, and he found himself inside some kind of building, surrounded by unfamiliar beings. I realized that they were discussing my life. One of them said that on Earth I had not done what I was supposed to do. Listening to their words, I understood that they were going to send me back, and I did not want at all to return to a body exhausted by illness, Ford recalled. Trying to avoid being sent back, he tightly grasped a doorway with his hands. In the next moment, a sensation of rapid falling into emptiness arose. After that, Ford awoke in his ward and saw a nurse nearby. Analyzing such stories and the experiences of people who were on the brink of death, Werner Schiebeler warned that it is easy to come to the mistaken conclusion that such experiences are always filled only with peace and joy from meeting departed loved ones. In reality, this is not the case. There is evidence that during clinical death, people experienced extremely severe and frightening states. In his research, Schiebeler drew attention to the accounts of non-believers who encountered such experiences. Thus, the cardiac surgeon Maurice Rawlings, in the book Beyond the Door of Death, described the agonizing experiences of patients who were unconscious or close to death. In one such case, an engineer recounted that he found himself near a sea of fire. He remembered, "I realized that I had left the earthly world and was standing at some distance from the blazing mass. In ordinary life, I did not think about God and never prayed to him, but standing near this fiery space, I began to implore him for salvation." After that, the person regained consciousness in his body. Among such negative experiences, Schiebeler also included the case involving the professor of the arts, Howard Storm. Prior to this event, Storm considered himself a convinced atheist. On the 1st of July 1985, he found himself in a hospital during a business trip. He required an urgent operation, while waiting for which he experienced clinical death. "While I was waiting for the doctor, a feeling of approaching doom seized me. I did not believe in God, and did not regard death as the beginning of another form of life. It was painful for me to realize that my life could end so senselessly at the age of 38. At some point, I stopped resisting, closed my eyes, and my consciousness began to fade." It seemed to me that I would never again see my wife and children, but then unexpectedly I quickly came to my senses, Storm recalled. He got up from the bed and felt no pain, yet noticed that all his sensations had become extraordinarily acute. Storm walked around the ward, feeling the movement of air and catching many different smells. It seemed to him that he was able to take in the entire space around him at once with his gaze. These new sensations deeply astonished him. All of Howard Storm's attempts to address the doctor remained unanswered. It seemed as if the female medical worker simply did not hear his words and paid no attention to him at all. At the same time, Storm noticed a body lying on the hospital bed. It was strikingly similar to his own, and this sight caused him great confusion. After some time, Howard heard someone calling out to him. He left the ward and saw several figures in the dark hospital corridor. The lighting was so dim that he could not make out their faces, and so he took them for members of the medical staff. Later, Storm recalled that he was told, "Hurry up, it is time to go. We are waiting for you. There is little time." He followed these silhouettes. According to his sensations, they walked together for quite a long distance, and only then did Storm realize that he was no longer in the hospital. Absolute darkness reigned around him. Howard told his companions that he refused to go any further. At that moment, the figures began to push and pull him, and a sinister, frightening laughter echoed around. Suddenly, Storm clearly heard his own voice. The words sounded clear and insistent. "Pray to God." This phrase was repeated several times in a row. However, Howard could not remember a single prayer. In his mind, fragments of oaths, lines from church hymns, and the words of the prayer, "Our Father," became mixed together. He began to utter scattered fragments of prayers. This clearly caused irritation among the beings. They claimed that God does not exist, and gradually withdrew into the darkness. In the end, Storm was left completely alone. After returning to life, Howard Storm radically changed his path. He abandoned his former profession and became a priest. He never regretted his choice. The only thing he regretted was the loss of his former friends, who adhered to scientific and atheistic views and turned away from him. Storm was convinced that he had been in hell, but this hell did not resemble the images seen in paintings at all. It was a space enveloped in mist, where darkness reigned and hostile entities dwelled. At the same time, in his view, it was not a place of eternal torment. One who manages to remember God, there is able to find a way out. This is how Werner Schiebeler interpreted this experience. Is contact possible between souls who have departed to another world and people who continue to live on Earth? Are there real examples of such communication? These questions were explored by the ethnographer and publicist Dmitry Bulgakovsky. I will not disappear. I will only pass into a spiritual reality. If a connection between the living and the dead were impossible, then where would the human desire to make contact with departed souls come from? This striving has existed always, throughout all ages and among all peoples, Bulgakovsky noted. He collected numerous testimonies about the appearances of the deceased. In the course of his research, Bulgakovsky observed that in many stories people saw their relatives and loved ones in dreams. However, such encounters also occurred in waking life. At such moments, the relatives of the deceased heard strange sounds, footsteps, rustling, knocks. Some felt an unseen presence, to which household animals often reacted as well. If for centuries people have been telling stories about such phenomena, and belief in the existence of another world has been preserved, then, in Bulgakovsky's opinion, there are no grounds to deny these facts, just as there is no reason to mock this belief or to regard those who share it as superstitious. In support of his conclusions, the publicist cited real stories of meetings between the living and the departed. One of them was told to him by a government official who was extremely far removed from mysticism and superstition. "My father was seriously ill. In his last letter, he urgently asked that I come to see him as soon as possible. This was not easy, since he lived in Chicago. Nevertheless, I put aside all my affairs and set out to him. My arrival greatly pleased him. He admitted that he would not want to leave this life without seeing me." This man recounted, "You will recover and live for many more years. Why do you speak of death like that?" The son tried to reassure his father. "No," the father replied, "I will not disappear. I will move into the spiritual world. You always laughed when you heard about another world, but now you will have the opportunity to change your opinion. When I am gone, I will come to you to say farewell. You must promise that you will tell everyone about this." The son gave such a promise, although deep down, he was convinced that his father's health would soon improve. However, thoughts about the spiritual world no longer left the old man. About 2 weeks passed, and the official calmed down since he was not receiving any alarming news from his father. However, one night, he suddenly woke up. The official listened and carefully looked around his room, trying to understand what had pulled him out of sleep. In a soft, barely noticeable glow, the image of his father appeared before him. Almost nothing about him had changed, only his face looked younger and more rested than during their last meeting. With a gentle smile, the father asked his son whether he remembered the promise he had given. After these words, his figure began to blur and soon disappeared into the darkness. The next day during lunch, the doorbell rang in the official's house. He was handed a telegram that read, "Father passed away today at midnight." It is noteworthy that the appearance of the visitor was also noticed by the family dog. According to Dmitry Bulgakovsky, a similar case happened to Mikhail Vasilyevich Lomonosov when he was returning to his homeland from abroad. While on the journey, Lomonosov had a dream in which he saw his father perish at sea, and his body being washed ashore onto a deserted island in the White Sea. Upon returning home, Mikhail Vasilyevich learned that his father had indeed gone missing. He had gone out fishing and never returned. Lomonosov decided to set out in search of his father's body on the island he had seen in his dream. The place was familiar to him, since he had visited it in his childhood. Fishermen who headed to the specified island truly discovered there the body of the deceased Vasily Lomonosov. Another story was related to Dmitry Bulgakovsky by a member of the Slavic Benevolent Society. This man's brother served as an officer. One day, together with a comrade, he was invited to a formal dinner. After it ended, the officers returned home in the same carriage. The storyteller's brother got out earlier, while his companion continued on. When the officer entered his study, he was astonished to see that same companion sitting at the writing desk with whom he had parted only a few minutes earlier. This struck him as extremely strange because he had not noticed the guest following him from the carriage. The servant of the officer also saw this person. Later that same evening, the servant reported to his master that the companion, after returning home, had suddenly died. Another unusual incident was recounted by a retired soldier who had once served in the cavalry artillery. In winter, he received a letter from his mother from a village in the Tula region in which she informed him that she intended to visit him in the summer. However, contrary to her words, the woman appeared in her son's house already at the end of winter. "I was in my room," he recalled. "Suddenly my mother appeared before me. I hurried toward her to embrace her, but as soon as I took a few steps closer, she vanished." This event amazed me so much that I did not immediately remember that, according to her letter, she was supposed to visit me only in the summer, and 2 weeks later, a neighbor informed me that my mother was gone. Another witness also shared his testimony. Several years ago, he recounted, his mother and sisters were in the lower rooms of their house. Suddenly, everyone heard a loud knock on the door. The mother told him to go and open it. Before he could run down the stairs, he saw his Aunt Talbot standing in the entryway. Judging by her behavior, the dog had also noticed the guest. The aunt walked into the living room, and the family followed her, but no one was there. Soon, a dispatch arrived from Yunus with news of her death. As it turned out, she had passed away at the exact moment when the family had seen her. Another story was told to Dmitry Bulgakovsky by a woman. As a child, one evening while at home near an almost extinguished fireplace, she saw the figure of a man in dark clothing. Looking more closely, the girl recognized her uncle, who served as a priest. She woke her sister, and after awakening, the sister also saw the mysterious silhouette. The frightened children began calling for the adults. Soon their father entered the room holding a candle, but there was no one by the fireplace anymore. The following morning, the family learned tragic news. Their relative, the priest, had passed away. Dmitry Bulgakovsky was convinced that such phenomena had occurred before, and would continue to occur, thereby reinforcing humanity's faith in the existence of life beyond earthly being.